All right, so when we did our Making Sense series, as you know, we put up that question and response form, and that was the same time that we also released our weekly Bible reading plan through the Gospel of Mark, which has ended up going on to Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Galatians and Philemon, a bunch of it, which has been great. But that week, we actually got a lot of questions about the Gospel of Mark, so I told you I would do my best to answer them, and that's what this part of the video is for. Before I answer them, though, I think it's worth pointing something out. The information I'm giving you always, in any context, is information that includes my interpretation, education, and understanding. And I think it's good for you to try to find answers in other places as well, and then take the information you have from different sources and come to your own understanding. That's something that I learned when I was in college, and hopefully it's something I want to pass on to you. Not just everything I know, but how I came to know what I know and how you should come to know what you know. Consider me one source in a world of tons of sources. All right, so with that, here we go. Question 1. This is from Mark chapter 1, verse 41. The question says, I'm curious as to why in verse 41 in the first chapter, the NIV, that's the version, states that Jesus was indignant instead of filled with compassion. Now, the question here is referring to the story when Jesus heals a man with leprosy. A guy comes to him and begs him on his knees. He says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. In verse 41, it says in the NIV, Jesus was indignant. He reaches out his hand, touches him, and says, I'm willing, and the man is cleaned. Okay, so if you look at the little footnote there, it says, many manuscripts say Jesus was filled with compassion. This is called a textual variant. What it means is that we have, nobody found the Bible all collected together. We've found shreds of it, and it's been preserved and held together. But some manuscripts have slight variations. No major ones. They're not going to totally, shipwreck your faith or make you change your beliefs, send your thoughts in a totally different direction. There are these minor things that maybe got confused by scribes. We don't know. All we know is some manuscripts said filled with compassion, some said indignant. And so the question is, well, which one is it? We don't know. However, I think that they both work. The one that says filled with compassion is consistent. We see Jesus frequently looking over crowds and being filled with compassion. Right at one point it says Jesus looks at a crowd, he's filled with compassion. He's like, they're like sheep without a shepherd. Indignant means angry. So why would Jesus be angry? Right? This guy's asking him for something. Is he just mad at this guy? Is he annoyed? Is he busy in a bad mood? Well, context. Back up. What's going on? We're in Mark chapter 1, and in the very beginning, one of the major themes we see is Jesus keeping who he is a secret. He does something, and then he tells people shh, don't say anything. And he's consistently saying this to different parties involved. Shh, don't say anything. This is because, from a very practical standpoint, he doesn't want people to know who he is yet. The more people that know, the harder things are going to be for him to function normally and accomplish what he's trying to do. So some guy comes up to him out of nowhere and is like, heal me. He doesn't know, the public are not supposed to know yet who Jesus is. And so if the original version says indignant, this is probably why. It's like, no one was supposed to tell people yet that I'm doing what I'm doing, because it wasn't the time to do that yet. So they both work. Good question. Next one. My question would start from the very beginning. Who is Mark? Who are the authors of the Gospels? Were they friends of the disciples? Were they related to Jesus somehow? Who are they? And why is Mark the first gospel in the Bible? So in the Bible, Matthew is the first gospel. However, Mark is the oldest gospel. The Gospel of Mark came first. The authors of the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was one of the disciples. He also went by Levi, the tax collector, went by Matthew. I don't really know why they had all these different names, but it's the same person. So he was actually there. So he wrote an account, and he was one of the disciples. Mark traveled with Paul at certain points. He was also really tight with Peter. He also goes by John Mark. And so the Gospel of Mark was most likely passed to Mark from Peter. These stories came from the mouth of Peter. Luke was a close friend of the Apostle Paul, and Luke says in the very beginning that he was creating an orderly account, like it's the only one that's in chronological order. So he's actually working from Mark and Matthew, and he's trying to put together a, cohesive account, biographical account of this. He knew Paul really well. He was also just acquainted with the group. These guys knew each other, and Luke was connected to all of them. So he has a number of different resources, you could say, or witnesses from whom he got his accounts from. And then John was known as the disciple that Jesus loved. He was the young guy, and he was actually there for all of this. And so he wrote John. Good question. Next one. Next question, chapter 2, verse 17, Jesus says, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." And the question is, who are the righteous ones that Jesus is talking about? He said he came for the sinners, but wasn't everyone a sinner? Great question. The answer is yes. Jesus is here for everyone. But what he's saying is that for those who think they're righteous, for those who think they have it all together, he's like, I've got nothing to offer you. In order for this whole thing to work, you've got to be willing to recognize that you've got broken pieces and broken parts, and then Jesus can step in and do something about it. So are we all sinners? Absolutely yes. But what Jesus is saying is, if you think you got it together, then I've got nothing to offer you. So great question. Next one. In chapter 2, verse 14, we meet someone named Levi. It says, as Jesus walked along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. The question says, the passage refers to the tax collector as Levi. I thought Matthew was the disciple who was the tax collector. Are Matthew and Levi the same person? Yes. I don't know why he gets two names. Probably because he's a Levite, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So kind of like how you'd say, I'm Italian, So maybe he's Matthew the Levite. Not totally sure, but he went by both Matthew and Levi. All right, the next question is about demons, which is fun. If the demons know who Jesus is, why not let them speak? Is it because God doesn't want us to believe out of fear rather than not believe out of fear? Why did Jesus not want the leper to speak? Was it because he thought people wouldn't truly believe in God if their problems disappeared? These are all good questions. However, the answer is pretty simple. There was a period, especially in the beginning, when Jesus told nobody, no party, to speak because he didn't want word to get out yet. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus's mom asked him to turn water into wine, or she's like, there's a problem, do something about it. He's like, it's not my time yet. In other words, there was a certain point that Jesus began doing Jesus things. And even after he started doing those Jesus things, he didn't want word to get out yet. And then at a certain point, things shifted and he started doing things very publicly. So that's a pretty simple answer to that question. He told people no parties to speak until a certain point in time. Next question. Was there any criteria or special selection process for how the disciples were chosen? I have no idea. And if you find out an answer to that question, let me know. Because that's a good question. But I don't know. All right, the next question is from Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 23, where Jesus and his disciples were going through grain fields and they were picking heads of grain. And they're criticized by the religious leaders. It says, look, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Then Jesus gives an example in the life of David, who came way before him. And then he ends by saying the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. All right, so here's the idea. A few things. One, he says the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath. That's a claim of who he is, right? That's an authority claim there. But he also points out the motive for the Sabbath commands, right? He's like, these are for you, like for your thriving, for your good, for your well-being. Like, don't miss the heart behind the instruction here. They needed to eat, and so they picked some heads of grain. The other thing that's probably worth noting is that the religious leaders were so obsessed with breaking rules that they made rules to keep people from even getting close to breaking the rules, and this would probably fall into that category. They're not necessarily not keeping the Sabbath, but they had these extra things, like you'd have to count your steps, and there were certain things you couldn't do and touch and places you couldn't go, all because they were afraid you were going to not honor the Sabbath. And so he's probably not even breaking an actual law from the Torah. He's more likely just like breaking one of their own cultural rules that they have prioritized over the intention of the actual command that God had given the ancient Jewish people. Good question, though. All right, the last question comes from Mark chapter 9, where there's this boy who has a demon, and the boy's father asks the disciples to cast out the demon, and they can't. So the boy goes directly to Jesus, or so the man goes directly to Jesus, and he's like, yo, your disciples couldn't help me. Can you help me? And Jesus mentions, like he says, yeah, this can happen, but you've got to trust me. You've got to believe. And the guy says, I believe, but help my unbelief. And then Jesus takes care of the situation. He does what the guy wants him to do. And then the disciples come up to Jesus and they're like, yeah, why couldn't we do this, right? You gave us the authority to do this. And Jesus responds by saying, this kind can only come out by prayer. Now, the question was, why? Like, why didn't they pray? And what in the world is going on here? Well, I'm summarizing the question. But it's one, the whole demon thing, that's a little foreign to us, right? But the general idea is that if you believe in a spiritual good, right, like God, there's also a spiritual bad. There's a spiritual evil. And during this time, Jesus confronted that directly. He also gave his disciples the ability to like remove these demons from people. But apparently this time they couldn't do it. Now, I'm not too familiar with situations like this, but if you look at the text and look at the story, there is a common theme here. And the theme is people going to Jesus, people going to God for help. And you see the man go straight to Jesus and he admits his unbelief. He's like, I want to be there. I'm like half there, but I'm not totally there. So help my unbelief. And Jesus meets him there. When the disciples are like, why couldn't we do what we were trying to do? He's like, there are some things you've got to go to God and ask God for. And this was kind of articulated in the question, but it was like, is the issue that you need to rely on God and not yourself for certain things? And I would say that's a great conclusion to come to, even if you're not totally sure what's going on there. Look for certain patterns and themes. And yeah, there is a theme there of people struggling and then making progress when they ultimately hand things over to God in the situation and trust him to deal with it. And so that's tough because that's not something that happens on a regular basis. It's pretty foreign to most of us. But I would say the lesson there is, at least one of them, is to take God has given us gifts and has given us the ability to do certain things, right? But there are a lot of things that we just have to put in his hands and trust him with it because they're beyond what we can do. So maybe you should look a little more into that on your own, but that's what I've got for you for that question. All right, so I know these were a little random, but I told you that I would do my best to answer them, and that was my best to answer them. So I hope that they were helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next part of the video.